What's common in all of these different genres is storytelling. And I remember once you were speaking about this tradition of storytelling that is really alive in India.
Oral stories.
Oral stories. And I think you'd gone to listen to a storyteller in
Kerala.
In
South
Kerala,
India.
yeah. So what is that experience like, and why do you think that it's such fertile?
Well, it's
grounds
just
of
interesting,
storytelling?
isn't it, that face-to-face oral storytelling is still a living form. And it allows you to learn certain things about how people receive stories, because you could physically watch them doing it. You know? And the thing that interested me was that the storytelling, and this was the most famous, Kerala storyteller who get big crowds wherever he went, and so on. The storytelling was not linear.
Right.
We know from Lewis Carroll that the way you're supposed to tell a story is Alice is instructed. Start at the beginning, go on until you reach the end, and then stop. But this is the exact opposite of what this guy was doing. That he would have a story which might be in origin from the old myths, the old story, but he would begin that story. He would immediately connect it to some political event taking place in the neighborhood, and so there would be a polemical section. Then he would connect it to a personal narrative, perhaps. Then he would tell a few jokes. He might even sing a song. There were like 5 or 6 different narrative processes going on at the same time, and I mean, like watching somebody juggling, and keeping all these balls in the air. And the skill of the telling was that you never drop the balls, that you keep all the stories going, and in a way that was satisfying to the audience. And I thought, this is the opposite of what you're taught. You're taught that that's confusing. But instead, here you have this ancient form where the storyteller always knows if it's not working, because the audience gets up and leaves, or it throws things. It behaves, or it makes boos. It behaves in ways which clearly express its displeasure. So the story, the oral story, has developed in order to prevent the audience from doing that. You have to keep the audience sitting there and enjoying it. Otherwise, not so good for you. And so I thought, this is clearly not random. This is what they've discovered, is that people enjoy receiving the stories more in this way than they would in a straightforward linear narrative. It increases their enjoyment rather than decreasing it. And so I thought, well, how do you do that in writing? I mean, if that works in the oral form, maybe there's a way to do that in the written form. And it was just one of the ways that I started thinking about how to do it.
And it influenced your...
Yeah, it did. It made me think, how do I do that? I'd like to do that, because it's enjoyable. I liked all that pyrotechnic aspect of it, sort of performative aspect of it, and I thought there must be a written down way of doing something like that. And yeah, it was very inspirational.
I think that is important to understand why there are so many Indian writers now and South Asian writers who are going out in the world, and people are reading their stories, because it's a place of these tremendous narrative traditions, the epics and myths of all countries that have come there, and this promiscuous mix of Bollywood films and the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and
and old wonder tales as well,
folk tales,
Panchatantra stories,
right?
All these things. And it's a wonderful thing to grow up in a story environment where the first thing you learn is that stories are not true. That there doesn't matter how realistically they are written, they are not true. So a flying carpet and Madame Bovary are untrue in the same way. Neither of them ever existed. And at the point at which you know that, you're free. And I think it's one of the things that the Indian tradition gives us as a gift, You know, that you arrive at truth in a story not by an imitation of life. Or that's only one of the ways you could do it. You know, and it's the difference, I guess, between a photograph and a painting. You know, the Starry Night of Vincent van Gogh is clearly not what it looks like if you look in the sky, you know, but it's a very good picture of a starry night. And I think that idea that you don't, it doesn't have to be journalistic realism in order to be truthful, you know, is a liberation. You know, and then sometimes you do the journalistic realism because that seems to be the way of making the point you want to make. But what it does is it gives you an orchestra. You have a lot of instruments in the orchestra, and you can decide which you're writing for this time. You know, and I mean, I've written, for instance, when I wrote Shalimar the Clown, and I was talking about Kashmir and all that. I mean, there's very little that you would call non-naturalistic in that novel. Very little. But there's tiny little bits of it, but almost entirely, it could be seen as a realistic novel. I think, you know, and that's because the material seemed to require it. You know, and other times, you know, you can be more playful. I think. But it's just wonderful to grow up in an environment of story which has the whole spectrum. You know, every possible kind of story, you understand that's part of the world of story, and you can draw on all of it. You know, so I always don't like it when I'm put into a bag. You know, like I often put in this magic realist box. And I think, no, that's just one of the things we can do. You know, and sometimes we do that, and sometimes we don't do it. And all of us can do that. You know. And all of us have done it. You know, if you think even about very celebratedly realistic writers like Flaubert, you know, he will also have novels like Salammbô, which are not at all realistic in many ways. And you have writers like Gogol who can write both naturalistically and fantastically. You know, so on. So I think writers in general are not that easy to pigeonhole.
Thank God for that.
Thank God for that.